change. It's a policy-driven transition, unlike a sort of more of a technology transition that we might have seen in the past. Our approach lays a heavy emphasis on governance, by which we mean rules of the game, rules and incentives which shape practices and outcomes in the energy system. So practices would be, for example, business models. It would be how people are trading on gas markets. It would be how people run their electricity generation portfolios and so on. So we've tried to develop a very general kind of graphic here, which tries to separate out some elements of what we think is going on in the system. Institutions and institutional systems here, these are the rules of the game. We think that they do influence practices and outcomes in the energy system. So outcomes would include patterns of investment, characteristics that relate to ecosystems like greenhouse gas emissions and so on. But these also feed back clearly into the formation of institutions and how they operate. But also, as Richard said, we're also very interested in, we think that the political context does matter a great deal. And by political context, we particularly, part of the politics comes from within this because of the role of large energy firms and other commercial actors. But we also think that the views of the public, the interests of the public, and matter as voters. We'll say a bit more about that later on. And also that what are often called policy paradigms matter. In other words, policymakers are usually working within a frame of ideas, and that also heavily influences the way that institutional systems are constructed. And as Richard said, we're also what we need is we need a comparative, and we need something that works for comparative analysis. I'll pass over to Caroline now to take you the next few slides.
Okay, so the first part of the presentation, not surprisingly, deals with the literature review of transitions theories, specifically those, for the most part, that deal with this particular transition that we're talking about. So not just change generically, thinking really about energy system change. And we take quite a lot from the various theories. So we looked at socio-technical, we looked at multi-level, we looked at co-evolutionary, and we looked at some economics theories. And particularly from STT and from economic history, we took some particular insights about the unprecedented nature of change this time around, the way that drivers are different this time around, the timing aspect of it, which I do think is pretty unprecedented. So we take those kinds of things from it, but we also, in particular, take the notion of different areas interlinked dynamically within systems. So we're sort of building from those kinds of insights. But then we have some areas where we think that we may be able to add a little bit of extra. Specifically, a more specific understanding of how the politics of energy are constituted within different contexts, and these different contexts are rather important to us, and how this relates to rules, incentives, and outcomes. A clearer understanding of how and why energy governance changes in different ways to address climate change mitigation. In specific, I think what we're trying to draw out is also how transition policy relates to other areas of policy, so not looking at it sort of as a standalone, but in relationship to other kinds of political goals, etc. We are trying to place more of a focus on the role of various actor groups, specifically how they interrelate with one another, but also with political institutions. And then a greater linking together of structure, agency, practice and outcomes, something I guess that we all try to do. So answering the sort of the political questions, we've drawn quite a lot in the paper on sociological institutionalism and historical institutionalism, new institutionalism, and we sort of have some various observations, but it's really about understanding the nature of energy politics and looking underneath energy politics and looking at the various different objectives of energy politics, but also then understanding how it relates to broader political structures and institutions. We suggest that narratives based in turn on paradigms influence policy decisions and structures, both during times of change as well as during times of relative status quo. New knowledge about climate change can be seen as one narrative driving energy governance change, clearly for the purposes of what we are looking for, which is a low-carbon energy transition. This is one of the most important narratives driving change. But we have to understand that there are competing narratives driving change within energy governance at the moment. Some related to security, sometimes understood in quite geopolitical terms, affordability and poverty, but also to do with economic growth. So within energy governance and energy politics, you have sort of competing narratives, but change within energy governance also has to contend with the existing policy paradigm, which in the paper we term, particularly for the UK, as neoliberal, and we talk about some of the outcomes of that, which we'll come back to later. Policy paradigms, so the winning narrative, if it's accepted and if it becomes embedded over time within a political system, influences the objectives of policy instruments, rules, regulations, structures. And I think the objectives are just particularly important here because the objectives of policy are often the reasons why the policy exists. You have to have a direction or a reason for a policy to exist. Otherwise it can become depoliticised and we don't bother about it so much. So I think that the objectives are very important here. And then clearly we also make the point that policy paradigms interact also with public sentiments, and these public sentiments are important when we're thinking about the objectives of policy, because public sentiments may or may not account strongly for climate change. They may not or may not consider that climate change is a big need for them when they come to vote in elections or in other kinds of ways. They may be more focused on jobs or security or sort of more traditional electoral interests. And then in terms of the comparisons that we're trying to do, we're relying on models of capitalism, which obviously look at different approaches to energy governance and explain it by looking at the different kinds of structures, coordinating economies or liberal communicative economies. And this in turn is related to electoral systems, and public sentiment again here is important. Now, being inspired by the socio-technical transitions literatures and this idea of the material and the sociological, we are trying to also account for material factors. We call them here historic and geographic factors, but I think we're also trying to think also about how material factors can be interpreted differently depending on how long historically they've been embedded within certain systems. So we just have a few points here. So we're including other areas. The distribution, our point is, of fossil fuels historically has been important for many countries. Obviously not for all countries, but has historically been important. And that has obviously led to embedded usage patterns and embedded infrastructures that can blind various actors, not just business actors or government actors, but also users, particularly to new technologies and to ways in which they can change. So then we look at the interrelationships between politics and energy infrastructures, and we suggest that indigenous resources are important given divisions still, if we're talking about geography, of a world of sovereign states, and we haven't quite managed to move away from the world of sovereign states. We're not a world of global governance quite yet. And so this is very important, I think, when you think about geography and indigenous resources. So you then have different roles for energy in society and different inferences of what energy means, different security, different economic implications for indigenous resources. And one example we look at is nuclear power also. So we suggest that countries with an historical interest in the military uses of nuclear power tend to have more established nuclear power and more favour for it in business and governance terms. So all of these interactions together shape low-carbon transition. They imply greater power for certain lobbies over others, so who is listened to, whose narratives are more important than other narratives. Nuclear over renewables sometimes can be chosen as a low-carbon option. And CCS, I think this also has implications for CCS, whether that is an important part of your pathway in terms of transition, because that allows you to keep your fossil fuels going and various business interests going. Now I will hand back to Matt.
Okay, so picking up on some of the literature, especially on the co-evolutionary approach that Tim has championed, we are very keen on looking at actors and agency. We think actors, the way to understand both transitions and regimes is to see them as emergent results of the interaction, the dynamic interaction between actors. Actors have this critical role, and in particular, it led us to think about what kind of actors we think will be important in the course of an energy transition. And in particular, what kind of actors will matter politically, because we see this as a highly political process. And we're trying to develop this approach in which we've identified three groups or types of actors: energy industry or energy providers, policymakers, and then energy users, which includes both households and businesses. We see actors as influenced by, constrained by, in the kind of classic politics approach, ideas, interests, and institutions. Institutions emerge from interactions, but they also constrain and influence actors. And as we had in the earlier diagram, it's the interaction of these different sets of actors produces practices which are indicated by the arrows. So, for instance, here you would have a lot of energy markets is actually, or retail energy markets are here between energy providers and energy users, or the construction of regulatory rules and incentives is here, if you like, between industry and government. But overall, these interactions produce what we're interested in looking at as sort of system properties, outcomes. This would include what kind of energy infrastructure you have, it would include what kind of technological change you have, and greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And these, of course, especially infrastructure, then feed back and constrain actors as well, because the actors are clearly constrained by physical infrastructure. How might it work? The final point is, I suppose, the dotted lines around the edges. These are supposed to represent contextual factors, factors which contextualize all actors. All actors are influenced by them. One is the knowledge of climate change, clearly, and different actors will be concerned to a greater or lesser extent about that. Another is the policy paradigm, the dominant policy paradigm, which Caroline has mentioned, and then these historical and geographical factors. They frame the interactions. So you can imagine a situation in which you have a concern about climate change is driving, it's a concern to voters, and therefore it's a concern to politicians because they also care what voters think. But at the same time, and as we know, other issues may be much more salient for voters, like things like energy costs. Policymakers have to balance those political interests with the political pressure they receive from incumbent energy firms and others in the energy supply firm to construct institutions in such a way that they can make a return on their investments. And quite a lot of energy policy is about that balancing act between these two groups of actors. We know that incumbent firms will seek to shape policy making through a range of different things: lobbying, secondments, being on technical committees, and so on. And we also sort of hypothesize that they'll try to maintain barriers to entry to their markets. And policymakers will also face lobbies from the historical and geographical energy factors. And so clearly a key issue here is, given these sets of interactions and institutions that arise, what might we expect to see? What's necessary for a sustainable transition to occur? And where might we see differences between countries? We're laying a great deal of emphasis on practices, and especially the need for actors to make enough money out of sustainable energy practices and investments to make it worth their while. So, in other words, sustainable energy practices, and for a transition to take place, institutions and policy have to be constructed so that this is the case. They have to be profitable enough, and profitable enough also relative to other uses of resources. And they also have to be adjusted for risk. But at the same time, those institutions and policies have to be politically acceptable to energy users. And that's clearly the cost issue. Business tends to see that in terms of competitiveness, households in terms of how high their energy bills are and so on. So policy has to steer away between that. We also think that inclusive arrangements in energy markets, in innovation, in infrastructure, and the way the networks are run, for example, are going to be much more conducive to innovation, innovative activities, innovative business models, investments in innovative technologies, than ones which are exclusive. So the UK, in our mind, has quite an exclusive arrangement. Has very, very market dominated by a few large players, and actually markets are quite constructed so as to reinforce barriers to entry more than some other countries. We think that the more that the dominant policy paradigm, and this is not just in energy but across all of the economic institutions, the more that that paradigm values sustainability as opposed to other characteristics like short-term monetary value, the more likely is a speedy transition will take place. And I guess the kind of final dynamic point is that policies need to be self-reinforcing in order to usher in a rapid transition. In other words, you've got to have both economic and political returns, increasing returns, in order to get a dynamic or movement towards a sustainable transition. If you don't, you can have attempts to change institutions, change markets and so on, but they will quickly die back and have no sustainable effect. I think the example of Germany is quite interesting, where effectively the feed-in tariff has created its own political momentum, and has sort of locked in a change, which is still controversial, but it actually has quite a lot of political momentum, and there are serious political spillovers going on there. In terms of our comparative analysis, we are focusing on two ideas or hypotheses. Again, looking at Germany, Denmark, looking at the UK in relation to these other countries. Partly in relation to this point, to a number of different mechanisms, we think that strong adherence to a neoliberal policy paradigm and more market-based economic institutions is likely to lead to a third transition. There's all sorts of reasons for that, through the construction of energy markets, through the way that policymakers think, that we're going to explore that as an idea. And the other is the influence of these historical and geographical factors. We think that strong fossil fuel-based lobbies will slow a transition, especially towards a low-carbon energy system, whereas strong nuclear lobbies will tend to shape or distort the direction of the transition that's followed. I think I'm just going to finish off final points there.
Looks like I am. And I'll do it really quickly. So, tentative conclusions. We were really setting out to ask some particular questions. I think when we think about transitions and we look at the other literatures, quite a lot of how questions are answered quite well, how transition takes place. But we were wanting to ask a few more why type questions, why things, policies are chosen over other policies, why outcomes relate to rules and incentives in certain ways. So we were hoping that it tells us why interactions between policymakers, energy providers and energy users result in certain outcomes. We're suggesting that these interactions are conditioned by the nature of political and institutional configurations, obviously looking there at policy paradigms and historical and geographic factors. And lastly, suggesting in combination that they result in differentiated transitions in different contexts, some more effective clearly than others, and the framework again explains why, my favourite word, why. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.